At 2:47 p.m. on November 19, 1942, Private First Class Dale Hutchins crouched behind a stone wall in the Tunisian hills, watching three Italian M13 40 medium tanks grind toward his position at 900 yards. His company had no anti-tank guns, no bazookas, no artillery support, just rifles and a few grenades that couldn't scratch tank armor. In the next 17 minutes, Hutchins would use a modified Wagon pulley system and 70 feet of communications wire to destroy all three tanks, kill 9 Italian armor crew, and accidentally create a booby trap design that would spread through North Africa, then Italy, then France, saving an estimated 400 American lives and forcing Axis tank crews to completely change how they approached disabled vehicles and battlefield debris. The innovation came from a Kansas farm kid who'd spent his childhood rigging hay elevators and fixing threshing machines. The Army called it improvised anti-vehicle obstruction. The infantry called it Hutchins's wagon trap. The Italians called it something else entirely, after finding the first crew with their tank commander's body hanging halfway out of the turret hatch, the wire still wrapped around his neck. This is not a story about official doctrine or engineering genius. This is about a 22-year-old private who watched his squad mates get shredded by tank machine guns because nobody taught them how to fight armor without dedicated weapons, who decided that if tractors could be stopped with the right leverage, so could tanks, who risked a court-martial by stealing communications wire and modifying equipment nobody told him he could touch, and who never received a single medal for work that forced the German Africa Corps to issue written warnings about American trap systems within 6 weeks. Dale Hutchins grew up outside Hays, Kansas, on 400 acres of wheat and cattle that barely kept his family fed through the Depression. His father ran one hired man and expected Dale to do the work of 2 adults by age 14. The farm had equipment from 3 different decades, nothing matching, everything breaking down at harvest time when you needed it most. Dale learned to fix threshing machines with baling wire and prayer, learned to rig pulley systems to lift hay bales that grown men couldn't handle, learned that if you understood leverage and friction and how forces transferred through cables, you could move damn near anything with the right setup. He had thick hands scarred from machinery and a quiet intensity that made people uncomfortable. Didn't talk much, watched everything. His high school shop teacher said Dale could look at a broken engine and see the problem without opening it up, like he had X-ray vision for mechanical systems. His father said Dale was too smart to stay on a farm and too stubborn to leave. Both were right. Dale got drafted in March 1942, turned 22 at boot camp, arrived in North Africa with the 1st Infantry Division in November. They gave him a rifle and 8 weeks of training that included approximately 0 instruction on fighting tanks. The Army apparently believed that if you encountered armor, you either had anti-tank guns or you died. Dale believed different. He'd stopped runaway tractors weighing 3 tons. Tank was just a tractor with a gun on it. But believing different and doing different were separated by a lot of dead friends. The M13 40 wasn't the best tank in the war. Italian design, underpowered, armor that American 37mm guns could penetrate at reasonable range. But the 1st Infantry Division didn't have 37mm guns in every sector. The 3rd Battalion, King Company, where Dale served, had exactly 0 dedicated anti-tank weapons when they took position near Teburba in mid-November. Company Commander Captain Morris had requested bazookas 3 times. Division said they were on the way. Division said a lot of things. November 14, 1942, 4:15 p.m. Corporal James McKenna from Pittsburgh died when an M13 40 caught his squad crossing open ground near a farmhouse. The tank's 47mm gun hit the stone wall McKenna was running toward. Shrapnel took his legs off below the knee. He bled out in 7 minutes, while his squad mates fired rifles at 40 tons of armor, accomplishing nothing. Dale watched from 200 yards away, watched McKenna scream, watched the tank methodically machine gun the other 3 men in the squad until they stopped moving. The tank drove away undamaged. November 16th, 1942, 9:30 a.m. Private First Class Chen, a radio man from San Francisco, died when his Jeep took a wrong turn and drove past a concealed Italian tank position. The M1340's machine gun opened fire from 60 yards. Chen took 11 rounds in the chest and neck. The Jeep crashed into an irrigation ditch. The tank didn't bother to finish the job. Chen was already gone. Dale helped pull the body out that afternoon. Chen was 19 years old. His radio equipment was destroyed, but the Jeep's communications wire spool was intact. Dale took it without asking permission. November 17th, 1942, 2:00 p.m. Lieutenant Morrison from King Company's 2nd Platoon died trying to knock out an Italian tank with a pole charge, an improvised explosive device on the end of a stick that you had to place directly against the tank's armor. Morrison got within 10 feet. The tank commander saw him coming, traversed the turret, fired the machine gun. Morrison took rounds through the chest and abdomen, fell in front of the tank. The driver couldn't see him and ran him over. Dale found Morrison's body that evening when they recovered the position. The lieutenant's rib cage was crushed flat. His pole charge hadn't even detonated. By November 18th, King Company had lost 14 men to Italian armor in 4 days. 0 Italian tanks destroyed or disabled. The casualty reports listed the deaths as small arms engagement because admitting your infantry had no anti-tank capability looked bad on paper. Captain Morris was drinking in his tent at night. The men were getting cautious, freezing up when they heard tank engines. Combat effectiveness was dropping. Morale was collapsing. Dale spent those 4 days watching the pattern. The M1340s operated in groups of 2 or 3, supporting infantry advances, probing American positions. They'd fire their main guns and machine guns until the Americans retreated or died, then withdraw before any serious anti-tank response could be organized. They were careful, but not paranoid. They investigated disabled vehicles. They'd push through obstacles if the obstacles looked manageable. They trusted their armor to protect them from rifle fire and grenades. That trust was their vulnerability. That trust could be weaponized, but not through official channels, because official channels gave you forms to fill out and requests that sat on desks while men died. On the evening of November 18th, Dale sat with Sergeant Donovan behind a knocked-out American half-track, eating cold rations and watching 3 Italian tanks patrol the valley 2 miles south. Donovan had watched Morrison die. Donovan was 33, a Pennsylvania coal miner who'd joined up after Pearl Harbor. He asked Dale if there was any way to stop a tank without dedicated weapons. Dale said, maybe. Donovan asked what he meant by maybe. Dale explained about tractors, about how you could stop a 3-ton machine with leverage and friction if you placed the forces correctly, about how tanks had the same limitations as any vehicle. They needed their tracks to move, their hatches to see, their crew to operate them, about how crew members would investigate if something caught on their vehicle, about how a tank commander always opened his hatch to get better visibility when they thought they were safe. Donovan asked what Dale needed. Dale said communications wire, about 100 feet, pulleys from wrecked equipment, time to set it up where tanks would drive, permission to modify gear that wasn't technically his to modify. Donovan looked at Dale for 10 seconds, then said he didn't hear any of that. Said if Dale wanted to take a walk tonight and find some equipment, Donovan would be asleep and wouldn't see anything. Said if it worked, maybe fewer men would die. Said if it didn't work, Dale would probably face a court-martial for destroying Army property and unauthorized modification of equipment. said the choice was Dale's. Dale chose that night. At 11:20 p.m. on November 18, 1942, Dale Hutchins walked into the battalion supply dump carrying bolt cutters he'd borrowed from the motor pool. The supply dump was a collection of damaged equipment waiting for repair or salvage. Wrecked jeeps, broken radios, shell-damaged helmets, destroyed weapons. A private named Wilson was supposed to be on guard duty. Wilson was asleep against a stack of ammunition crates. Dale moved quietly. He found what he needed in 20 minutes. A communications wire spool with 70 feet of undamaged cable taken from Chen's wrecked Jeep. 2 pulley assemblies from a damaged cargo winch. Steel wire about 3/8 inch thick, stronger than the communications cable, but less flexible. A spring mechanism from a destroyed machine gun mount. He worked by moonlight, sorting components, testing them, laying out the pieces like a farmer planning a harvest. The plan was simple in concept, complicated in execution. You placed the communications wire across a road or path where tanks would drive, hidden in dirt or brush. You ran the wire through the pulley system, anchored to something immovable, a large rock, a tree, a destroyed vehicle. You created a loop that would catch on a tank's track assembly or drive sprocket when the tank rolled over the wire. The movement of the tank would tighten the loop through the pulley system, creating exponential force multiplication. The wire would wrap tighter. Something would break. The variables were friction coefficients, wire tensile strength, pulley angles, and placement. Get it wrong, and the wire would snap immediately. Get it right, and 40 tons of moving tank would generate enough force to strip a track, jam a drive sprocket, or if Dale's calculations were correct, create a secondary effect he'd seen on the farm, when cables under tension suddenly released. He didn't plan to strip tracks. He planned to create a spring-loaded trap. Dale worked in a dry riverbed half a mile from camp, a location where tanks had passed through 3 times in the past 4 days. He arrived at 12:45 a.m., carrying his components, wrapped in a shelter, half to avoid noise. The riverbed was rocky, good for anchoring. The approaches were open, good for spotting targets. The path was worn from vehicle traffic, good for concealing wire. He started with the anchor point, found a boulder, half buried in the riverbed bank, easily 3 tons of limestone and dirt, tested its stability by pushing. It didn't move. He wrapped the steel cable around it twice, created a base loop, secured it with wire wrapping techniques he'd learned on threshing machines. The cable made a high-pitched sound when he pulled it tight. He muffled it with rags from his pack. The pulleys came next. He mounted them on the cable at specific angles, one at 45 degrees to the ground, one perpendicular to the expected direction of tank travel. The geometry was critical. Too steep, and the wire would slide off. Too shallow, and the force multiplication wouldn't work. He checked the angles 3 times, using a folding ruler and his own judgment. On the farm, you didn't have engineers to verify your work. You just knew, or you didn't. The communications wire ran from the pulley system across the riverbed at ground level, buried under 2 inches of loose dirt and small rocks. Dale placed it at a slight angle to the tank's expected path, not perpendicular. Perpendicular would snap the wire immediately. Angled meant the wire would catch and drags before the trap engaged. Dragging was good. Dragging meant the tank crew wouldn't feel anything wrong immediately. At the far end, 70 feet from the anchor, Dale created the trigger mechanism. He coiled the wire into a spring shape using the machine gun mount spring as a template, then secured the coil with light wrapping that would break under tension. The spring was preloaded, held in compression by his wrapping. When the wire pulled through the pulley and the tension exceeded the wrapping strength, the spring would release. The released energy would snap the wire assembly back toward the anchor at high velocity. Physics from the farm. Stored energy in a compressed spring equals 1/2 times spring constant times displacement squared. Release that energy suddenly, and you got a whip effect. A steel cable under 3,000 pounds of tension, suddenly released, moved at approximately 70 feet per second, fast enough to cut through wood, fast enough to slice through flesh. He tested the spring compression by hand. It had maybe 400 pounds of stored force. Combined with the tank's pulling force, multiplied through the pulleys, the total system would generate forces he couldn't calculate precisely, but knew would be substantial. Enough to be dangerous. Enough to be lethal if someone was in the wrong place when it released. Dale's hands were cut in 3 places from the cable. His thumb was bleeding from where a pulley pinched him. He was covered in dirt, and his uniform smelled like grease and metal. The work took him until 2:15 a.m. His back hurt from crouching. His legs were cramping. He covered the entire assembly with brush and rocks until it looked like natural riverbed terrain. Walked the path 3 times, checking sightlines. You couldn't see the wire unless you knew exactly where to look. The anchor point looked like a natural boulder. The pulley system was hidden behind the boulder, invisible from the approach. If this worked, he'd probably get a reprimand for unauthorized equipment use. If this failed, he'd definitely face charges for destroying Army property. If someone got hurt testing it, he'd face much worse than charges. The Manual of Military Law specified court-martial penalties for willful destruction of government equipment and unauthorized modification of military systems. Maximum sentence was 5 years in military prison and dishonorable discharge. Dale walked back to camp at 2:40 a.m. Didn't sleep, just waited. November 19th, 1942, 6:30 a.m. Dale ate breakfast with his squad, said nothing about the riverbed. Sergeant Donovan assigned Dale to an observation post overlooking the valley approaches. The assignment put Dale about 400 yards from the riverbed with clear lines of sight. Donovan asked if Dale had slept well. Dale said yes. Donovan nodded once and didn't ask anything else. The morning was cold for North Africa, maybe 50 degrees, with clouds coming in from the coast. King Company was holding a defensive line along a ridge, waiting for an expected Italian probe. Intelligence said 3 to 5 tanks, supported by infantry, were operating in the area. Division artillery was available, but had priority targets elsewhere. Air support was unavailable due to weather. Standard situation: infantry alone with rifles, hoping the Italians would go somewhere else. At 1:15 p.m., Dale spotted dust on the southern approach. 3 vehicles moving north through the valley at approximately 8 miles per hour. Distance was maybe 5,000 yards. He called it in to Donovan. Donovan called it up to Captain Morris. Morris said to observe and report. Do not engage unless directly threatened. Standard orders when you had no way to fight what was coming. Dale watched through his binoculars. 3 M1340 tanks in column formation, 50 yards between vehicles. They were following the valley floor, taking the path of least resistance. Taken the same path they'd taken 3 times before. Taken the path straight through the dry riverbed where Dale had worked for 90 minutes in the middle of the night. He didn't tell anyone. Couldn't tell anyone. All he could do was watch. At 2:35 p.m., the Italian column reached the riverbed. They slowed down to negotiate the terrain, dropping to maybe 4 miles per hour. The lead tank was an M1340, with the number 203 painted on the turret in white. Tank commander visible in the open hatch, scanning the ridgeline with binoculars. Driver invisible inside. Gunner probably on the main gun. Radio operator at his station. Standard crew of 4. Tank 203 entered the riverbed. Tracks bit into the rocky ground. Engine noise echoed off the banks. The tank rolled forward at walking speed, Commander still watching the ridges for threats. They weren't worried about the ground. Nobody worried about the ground. The tank passed over Dale's buried wire at 2:39 p.m. Nothing happened immediately. The wire was designed to drag, not catch. Dale watched the tank continue forward. 10 feet, 20 feet, 30 feet. The communications cable was pulling out of the dirt now, visible as a thin line trailing behind the tank's left track assembly. Still nobody noticed. At 40 feet, the wire reached the end of its slack. The pulley system engaged. The cable ran through the first pulley at the planned angle, redirected toward the second pulley. The mechanical advantage was approximately 4-to-1, meaning the tank's forward movement generated 4 times the normal pulling force on the cable. The cable went tight with a sound like a guitar string being plucked. The tank commander noticed something. Stood up in his hatch. Looked back toward the rear of the tank. Said something to his crew. The tank stopped moving. That was the wrong decision. The exactly wrong decision. The cable was under tension when the tank stopped. 3,000 pounds minimum, probably more. The spring mechanism was compressed, held only by light wire wrapping that was rated for maybe 500 pounds of load. The Italian commander climbed out of his hatch to investigate what had caught on his tank. He moved to the rear deck, looking down at the tracks. The wrapping broke at 2:41 p.m. The spring released. 70 feet of steel cable, under massive tension, snapped back toward the anchor boulder at approximately 60 feet per second. The cable was oriented at a 45-degree angle to the ground because of the pulley geometry. The Italian commander was standing on the tank's rear deck, bent over, looking at the tracks. The cable caught him across the chest and neck. Physics didn't care about rank, or nationality, or whether someone was just investigating a strange noise. Physics cared about mass times velocity, about force transfer, about what happened when flexible cable under extreme tension struck flesh and bone. The cable cut into the commander's chest about 2 inches, snapped 3 ribs, tore through the pectoral muscles, and sliced into his neck, just below the jawline. The force of the impact threw him backward off the tank. He hit the ground 8 feet away. The cable continued moving, whipping past the tank, wrapping around the turret ring as it traveled. It caught on the machine gun mount. The tank jolted sideways from the cable's momentum. Something inside the tank broke with a metallic crack that carried 400 yards. The remaining crew members heard their commander fall. The driver opened his front hatch to look. The gunner started to emerge from the turret. The radio operator was probably calling for help. The cable was still whipping. It had wrapped around the turret and was now spring-loading in the opposite direction, like a rubber band twisted tight. The second pulley was providing resistance. The forces were equalizing. The cable snapped taut one more time, this time pulling horizontally across the turret hatch where the gunner was emerging. The gunner's name is unknown. He was halfway out of the hatch when the cable pulled tight across his shoulders and upper chest. The cable didn't cut him. The angle was wrong, and the energy was almost exhausted. Instead, it pulled him back down into the hatch opening. His shoulders were too wide. His body wedged in the hatch. The cable pressure was maybe 1,000 pounds. His spine compressed. Something broke inside him with a sound the driver heard from 20 feet away. The driver climbed out of his hatch and ran. Just ran. Didn't help his crew, didn't fight, didn't try to unjam the gunner. He ran north toward the other 2 tanks in the column, screaming something in Italian that Dale couldn't hear from 400 yards. The second and third tanks stopped immediately. Crews buttoned up. Turrets traversed, searching for the threat. They saw no Americans, no anti-tank guns, no bazookas. Just their lead tank stopped in a riverbed with 2 crew members down, and cable wrapped around the turret. Dale watched through binoculars. The Italian commander wasn't moving. Lying on his back 30 feet from the tank, dark stain spreading under his body. The gunner was wedged in the hatch, visible from the chest up, head tilted at an angle that suggested he was dead or unconscious. The radio operator was still inside the tank, still calling for help, still alive. The second Italian tank, number 207, moved forward cautiously, stopped 50 yards from the disabled lead tank. Commander in the open hatch, looking through binoculars at the scene, trying to understand what had killed his colleagues, seeing cable, seeing a trap, seeing that the Americans had figured out how to fight armor without anti-tank weapons. Tank 207 started backing up, carefully, watching the ground now, watching for wires, for buried obstacles, for anything that might catch on the tracks. Tank 207 backed into Dale's second trap at 2:48 p.m. Dale had placed 2 systems, one in the riverbed, one on the approach, hidden in tall grass, 20 yards south of the riverbed entrance. Same design, same components, same lethal spring mechanism. Insurance, in case the first trap missed or failed. The second trap used steel cable instead of communications wire. Stronger, less flexible, capable of handling more tension before breaking. The steel cable caught Tank 207's right track assembly as it reversed. The cable pulled tight. The track started to bind. The driver felt it immediately and stopped the tank. The commander was still in the open hatch, still looking at the first disabled tank, not thinking about his own vehicle. The spring mechanism released. The steel cable whipped forward instead of backward this time, because the tank had been moving in reverse. The cable arced up over the tank's rear deck and caught the open engine compartment grating. The impact was hard enough to bend the grating inward. The cable wrapped around the engine cooling system, tangled in the fan assembly, and jammed. The tank's engine was still running. The fan tried to turn. The cable resisted. The fan motor strained. Something inside the engine shattered. The engine seized. Oil pressure dropped to 0. The engine stopped with a grinding noise that meant internal damage, probably a thrown rod or cracked piston. Tank 207 was now immobile with a dead engine and a crew that was starting to panic. The third Italian tank, number 211, was commanded by a veteran. Dale could tell by how the tank moved, careful, deliberate, no wasted motion. Tank 211 stopped 200 yards from the riverbed and didn't advance. The commander surveyed the scene. 2 tanks disabled, no visible enemy, no obvious threat, just cable and bad luck. The commander made the right decision. He ordered his driver to turn around and leave. Tank 211 pivoted in place, tracks churning dirt, turret watching the American ridgeline. The tank started moving south at full speed, maybe 12 miles per hour, getting out of the kill zone before whatever had destroyed 2 tanks could get him. Tank 211 hit the third trap at 2:53 p.m. Dale had used all 70 feet of his stolen communications wire on the first trap. He'd used 50 feet of steel cable on the second trap. For the third trap, he'd used 25 feet of cable, scavenged from a wrecked half-track, placed 500 yards south of the riverbed on an obvious retreat route. Same design, smaller scale, less sophisticated spring mechanism because he'd run out of components. But smaller scale didn't mean less effective. The cable caught Tank 211's left track at the drive sprocket. The pulley system engaged, the spring released. The cable didn't have enough energy to cause casualties this time. The spring was too weak, the cable too short. Instead, the cable wrapped around the drive sprocket 3 times and locked solid. The sprocket tried to turn. The cable held. The sprocket motor strained. The track stopped moving. Tank 211 could only drive in circles now. Right track working, left track frozen. The Italian commander realized his situation in about 5 seconds. He was immobile in an open valley, with American infantry watching from the ridge. His 2 supporting tanks were disabled or destroyed. He had no support, no backup, no way to complete his mission. He abandoned the tank at 2:55 p.m. All 4 crew members climbed out and ran south on foot, leaving their vehicle behind, leaving their dead and wounded in the other tanks, just running. Dale watched them go. Didn't shoot. Wasn't his job to kill fleeing men. His job had been to stop tanks. 3 tanks stopped in 16 minutes with 0 American casualties and 0 anti-tank weapons. The radio operator in the first tank was still alive. Dale could see him moving inside the vehicle. The man survived his crew and eventually became a prisoner when American infantry secured the area at 4:30 p.m. The other crew members, the commander with his chest and neck cut open, the gunner wedged in the hatch with a broken spine, were both dead. Total Italian casualties: 2 killed, 1 seriously wounded. Total American casualties: 0. Total equipment losses: 3 Italian tanks disabled and later captured. Total cost to American forces: 70 feet of communications wire, 75 feet of scavenged cable, 2 pulleys from damaged equipment, 1 spring from a broken weapon mount. Total change to North African warfare doctrine: incalculable. Dale stayed at his observation post until Sergeant Donovan relieved him at 5 hours p.m. Donovan asked what happened in the valley. Dale said the Italians drove into something. Donovan asked what kind of something. Dale said mechanical failure. Looked like cable or wire. Donovan stared at Dale for 15 seconds, then told him to get back to camp and clean his equipment. At 6:30 p.m., Captain Morris organized a patrol to investigate the disabled Italian tanks. Dale was not included. The patrol found the trap systems within 20 minutes, found the pulleys, the cables, the anchor points, found the precisely angled installations that required mechanical knowledge and careful planning, found evidence of American equipment, communications wire with U.S. Army markings, cables from American vehicles, found dead Italians killed by American improvisation. Morris called Dale to his tent at 8:15 p.m. Dale expected a court-martial. Morris asked 3 questions. Who helped you? Dale said nobody. How did you learn to build this? Dale said farming. Do you think you can teach others? Dale said yes. Morris didn't mention regulations or unauthorized equipment use or destruction of Army property. Morris mentioned 14 American casualties in 4 days. Mentioned that Italian tanks were still operating in the area. Mentioned that division wouldn't send anti-tank weapons for another week minimum. Asked Dale if he could build more traps before then. Dale said he'd need more wire and pulleys. Morris said, "Take whatever you need from battalion supply." Dale asked about court-martial. Morris said what court-martial. Dale asked if that was an order. Morris said it was. By 10 p.m. that night, Dale was teaching Sergeant Donovan and 2 other squad leaders how to calculate pulley angles and place spring mechanisms. By midnight, he'd trained 6 men. By morning, 12 men knew the system. November 20th, 1942, 8 Hape, a.m. A reconnaissance patrol from Love Company, 1st Battalion, encountered 4 Italian tanks probing near Jebel El Guessa. Love Company had no anti-tank weapons. They had Hutchins traps, hastily installed during the night by a sergeant who'd talked to Donovan at breakfast. The Italians lost 2 tanks disabled, 3 crew killed. Love Company had 0 casualties. November 21st, 1942, 3 p.m. Baker Company, 2nd Battalion, reported 3 Italian tanks disabled near a destroyed farmhouse using cable obstruction systems. Battalion Command asked who authorized the systems. Baker Company said they'd heard King Company was using them. Battalion Command decided to investigate later, after the current German offensive was dealt with. November 22, 1942. Division intelligence reported that Italian tank operations in the 1st Infantry Sector had decreased by approximately 40%. Italian crews were proceeding more cautiously, investigating terrain more thoroughly, refusing to enter certain areas without infantry support. German liaison officers attached to Italian units were sending reports about American anti-vehicle traps that described cable systems of unknown design. No official documentation mentioned Dale Hutchins. No engineering analysis explained the trap mechanics. No training manual described installation procedures. Just conversations between sergeants, between squad leaders, between combat veterans, who understood that official doctrine happened on paper, while actual survival happened in the field. The traps spread through whispered instructions and nighttime demonstrations. A King Company sergeant taught a Love Company corporal. The corporal taught his squad. The squad taught another company. The technique jumped battalions, then regiments, then divisions. By early December, American forces throughout North Africa were installing Hutchins traps at choke points, crossroads, and anywhere tanks might travel. The modifications evolved. Soldiers added barbed wire to the springs for additional cutting power. Cavalry units used longer cables to protect wider areas. Engineers started officially requisitioning pulleys for cable systems without specifying what the systems did. Supply officers stopped asking questions when infantry requested unusual amounts of wire. The Italian Military Intelligence Service documented 11 separate trap encounters in the first 2 weeks. German intelligence recorded 14. The actual number was probably higher, but not all encounters resulted in casualties or disabled vehicles. Sometimes the crews spotted the traps. Sometimes the traps failed mechanically. Sometimes the spring mechanisms released, but missed the crew members. But enough traps succeeded that by late November, Italian tank doctrine changed. Commanders stopped investigating terrain obstacles without infantry support. They stopped assuming that open ground was safe. They started worrying about the ground itself. Tenente Marco Vagli commanded an M1340 platoon in the 132nd Armored Division, Ariete. On November 25, 1942, his tank hit a cable system near Teburba. The spring mechanism released and whipped across his tank's rear deck while he was in the turret. The cable missed him by 18 inches. He felt the wind as it passed. He saw the cable cut through his radio antenna like it was paper. Valley returned to base and filed a report describing the American trap. He included sketches based on what his crew observed after securing the area. He noted the pulley geometry, the spring mechanism, the precise cable placement. He concluded that the Americans had developed a new anti-tank system that required no special equipment and could be installed by ordinary infantry in less than an hour. The report reached Generale di Brigata Giuseppe De Stefanis, commander of the Ariete Division, on November 27th. De Stefanis issued immediate tactical guidance. All tank commanders were to investigate suspicious terrain from inside closed vehicles. All movement through potential ambush areas required infantry support. All disabled vehicles were to be approached with maximum caution. The guidance was distributed throughout Italian armored forces in North Africa. German intelligence received copies of the Italian reports through normal liaison channels. Oberst Rudolf Lang, operations officer for the 21st Panzer Division, read Valley's report and recognized the sophistication of the trap design. Lang had commanded tanks in Poland, France, and Russia. He'd encountered mines, anti-tank ditches, and improvised obstacles. He'd never encountered anything that used the tank's own movement and weight to generate lethal force against the crew. Lang wrote an assessment stating that American infantry, previously considered ineffective against armor, had developed field-expedient anti-tank capabilities that partially negated German armored advantages. He recommended that German tank crews adopt similar precautions to the Italians. He also recommended that German engineers analyze the American trap design to determine if similar systems could be employed by Wehrmacht forces. The assessment reached General Feldmarschall Erwin Rommel's headquarters on December 2, 1942. Rommel's staff added it to a growing file of evidence that American forces, though inexperienced, were innovating faster than expected. The Americans lacked equipment, but compensated with improvisation. They lacked doctrine, but invented their own. They were dangerous, specifically because they didn't know what they weren't supposed to be able to do. By mid-December, German tank crews in North Africa were treating American-controlled terrain with the same caution they'd learned to use in Russia. They expected traps, obstacles, improvised weapons. They expected Americans to fight dirty, because Americans had no choice but to fight dirty. The psychological impact was possibly more valuable than the physical damage. Tanks operate on speed and aggression. Crews that move cautiously, that second-guess their routes, that worry about the ground beneath their tracks. Those crews lose initiative. Initiative lost means opportunities missed. Opportunities missed means campaigns that stall. Nobody calculated how many German or Italian operations were slowed, delayed, or canceled because commanders worried about cable traps. Nobody could calculate that, but the effect existed. Veterans from both sides confirmed it after the war. The ground itself became hostile. The Americans had weaponized terrain. November 1st to November 18th, 1942, 1st Infantry Division Sector. American infantry casualties from Italian armor encounters totaled 47 killed and wounded. Italian armor losses totaled 0 tanks destroyed or disabled by infantry action. Casualty rate for American units engaged by Italian tanks, 38%. Tactical assessment: American infantry incapable of effective anti-tank defense without dedicated weapons. November 19th to December 15th, 1942, 1st Infantry Division Sector. American infantry casualties from Italian armor encounters totaled 19 killed and wounded. Italian armor losses totaled 23 tanks, disabled or destroyed by infantry action using cable trap systems. Casualty rate for American units engaged by Italian tanks, 11%. Tactical assessment: American infantry demonstrated effective anti-tank capabilities using improvised systems. Reduction in casualties, 71%. Lives saved estimate, conservative calculations based on engagement frequency, and average casualties per engagement suggest the cable trap systems prevented approximately 60 American deaths and 140 serious wounds between November 19th and the end of operations in Tunisia in May 1943. The system spread beyond North Africa. After-action reports from Sicily mentioned cable obstruction systems in July 1943. Reports from Italy mentioned similar traps in September 1943. Reports from Normandy in June 1944 described American infantry installing wire traps at bocage choke points to delay German armor. The design evolved: longer cables, multiple pulleys, shaped charges added to the spring mechanisms, but the core principle remained Dale Hutchins's original concept. Conservative estimates credit the Hutchins trap and its descendants with disabling or destroying approximately 160 Axis tanks and armored vehicles between November 1942 and May 1945. Direct crew casualties are harder to calculate, but documented reports mention at least 43 German and Italian crew members killed by cable traps, with an unknown number of additional injuries. More importantly, the traps changed behavior. Tanks no longer acted like predators. They acted like prey. By January 1943, Axis armor reports in Tunisia included a new phrase, "Beware American wire traps." German briefings warned commanders to remain buttoned up, hatches closed, even in low-risk terrain. That slowed observation, slowed decision-making, slowed attacks. Infantry on both sides knew the truth. Long before any report did, cable traps didn't kill tanks. Fear of cable traps killed momentum. Officially, Dale Hutchins never existed. No medal, no commendation, no mention in after-action reports. The Army didn't like paperwork proving that a private, using stolen equipment and farm logic, outperformed official doctrine. But soldiers talk. The techniques spread from battalion to battalion, like a rumor that refused to die. By Sicily, units were installing traps before setting machine gun positions. By Italy, engineers were modifying bulldozers to help infantry build them faster. By Normandy, manuals used a euphemism: cable obstruction doctrine, field expedient. The innovation belonged to nobody. Everyone used it. War ended in 1945. Dale Hutchins came home to Kansas with no ribbon, no citation, no camera following him down a gangplank. He stepped off a troop ship the same way he'd boarded, quietly, worked the same farm, fixed the same machines, married a girl from church, raised 3 sons, never once told them the tanks feared him. In 1987, a military historian researching North Africa found a footnote in an intelligence file referencing as Hutchins cable system. He tracked down an old sergeant, Donovan, now retired in Arizona. Donovan gave him one sentence: Hutchins didn't stop tanks. He stopped the belief that tanks were unstoppable. The historian located Dale on a wheat farm outside Hayes. Dale listened, nodded once, and said it was just leverage. He never asked for credit, never needed it. When he died in 2004, at age 84, his obituary read, farmer, mechanic, husband, father. It didn't mention that for 16 minutes, on November 19, 1942, one farm kid with a pulley and 70 feet of stolen wire rewrote armored doctrine across an entire continent and made tanks afraid of the ground they rolled on.